If anyone's ready.
Good morning and welcome to the Fair Housing Act Design and Construction Requirements Workshop. We're excited to be partnering with the NC Legal Aid Fair Housing Project and Richard Duncan of the R.L. Mace Universal Design Institute with our local resources. So thank you everybody who is here in person as well as online. And there will also be the opportunity for having this recording sent out to everybody, hopefully along with the slides. So those resources will be able to be utilized after the workshop. Thank you, everybody. Just so everybody who's here, we've got parking stickers for the parking deck. So grab one on your way out. And if you need restrooms, they're out back and down the hall and to the left. So thank you, everybody, for being here. And we will get started. So we have Richard Duncan with the R.L. Mace Universal Design Institute, who's going to be doing a lot of the presentation today. And then A.D. Scaff with the Fair Housing Project, who will be covering a lot of how the CDBG DR funding and the federal accessibility interact in terms of multifamily housing. So we're really excited to have them here today. And please welcome Richard. Maybe starting. All right. Thank you.
Okay. I want to thank everyone for being here and for being online. And if you're watching this later, thank you for watching it later. This was put together quickly, and I really appreciate the county and Richard for giving me some grace and patience for this very quickly put together training. We're hoping that maybe we can do a longer training. This will certainly be an overview, because this is a detailed topic, but Richard's going to give a good overview today. And I'm going to try and be quick because he has a lot of information to get through. But the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Relief Funding, of course, it is now in this area after Helene. Buncombe County is administering it, and the state is also administering it through the Renew NC program. It was GROW, but I think it's now Renew NC. Yes, okay. And so it's pretty well established that the federal accessibility standards apply to multifamily housing, but because the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Relief Funding is also federal funding, Section 504 applies, and then that means that it still has to adhere to these accessibility standards when it comes to homeowners or applicants with disabilities. And it doesn't just apply to multifamily housing, but also single family housing. And so I've got a handout, and it'll be included in anything that's sent out, and there's one here that goes over the authority for that statement. And I'll just add that the Trump administration did issue a memo last year in March that revised some of the requirements for the Helene funding, but did not change this requirement. And so that requirement, it stands. There are a few other, I think, minor things when it comes to like building standards, but the accessibility part still stands. And so if you have any questions, I've also put my email address at the bottom. And so hopefully that makes sense to everyone. As Richard starts going through this, and he's going to be talking sort of broadly and in particular about multifamily housing, but just I guess in your mind, if it applies to you, like it also applies to these single family housing as far as repair and reconstruction. Any questions from our crowd? All right, cool. Okay, well, then I'm going to welcome Richard Duncan, and he is going to, fill your head with lots of great information and knowledge.
Thank you, AD. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to talk about this topic. I'm going to make sure I have my technology figured out correctly. As the slide suggests, we'll talk about the Fair Housing Act design and construction requirements. And we'll take you on, as AD described, kind of an overview of this because each topic is rather deep and we can spend a lot more time on it. So consider this an introduction. We can answer some questions perhaps here, maybe others later, and we'll give you a bunch of resources, which I think is one of the important things we'll leave you with for this. So I've divided this into section 1 and section 2. We're not going to take a break because it's only 90 minutes. So we'll just go through, and I've divided up the guidelines arbitrarily 1 through 4 and then 5 through 7. So we'll cover all of those and a few extra things along the way. So the act that we're referring to is the Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988, to be technical. It is one of the two kind of big federal dogs that we think of in terms of accessibility in the built environment in this country. It covers, as you'll see, multifamily housing primarily. The other companion to this, as people probably already know, is the Americans with Disabilities Act, passed a few years later, which mainly covers things non-residential, strictly speaking, but between those two acts, federal acts, both civil rights laws, most of the built environment is covered with a few notable exceptions. And they're designed to enhance the lives of protected classes of people with disabilities, who, as it's defined, have impairments which substantially limit one or more major life activities. As you'll see, briefly, the benefit population is far larger than these protected classes, and that's kind of a good thing, I think. So both of these acts came about in the 1900s. We go back that far. My work goes back 40 years into the 1980s, so I was working on this back then. And back then, we spent about the last 40 years of that century working hard to figure out how we accommodate the design needs of these protected classes of people, folks with disabling conditions. We had no real idea before then how to accommodate that in the design of our built environment. So it was a long 40-year period. We figured out a lot of stuff along the way. We were pointing to at that time with that constituency of the growth in the numbers of people with disabling conditions was about 20% of the population has a disability. At this point, that number is actually larger, which is fine. You'd expect this in some respects. We were also looking at another statistic from then, which is that not only that, but 70% of Americans have a disability at some point in time. So the 20% number, a little small, I think, at this point. The 70% number was wrong then and now. It's actually very close to 100%. Each and every one of us, unless we're very unlucky, don't live long enough, encounters over the course of their life, whether young, middle-aged, or older, something that causes them to interact with the environment in different ways. They acquire some kind of physical impairment, mental impairment that affects their ability to use the environment. So in fact, the beneficiary group is quite broad and also quite dynamic. All of us, maybe you can think of examples in your own lives or your family's lives, move in and out of impairment at various points during our lives. Maybe it's a bad back, as happens to people my age, or various other things. So it's dynamic, the numbers are large, nobody really escapes unless you're quite unlucky, and lots of things happen to us. Maybe these things have happened to you or members of your family. You have accidents, hopefully you recover. In some cases you may not. You may have a chronic disabling condition, and you can take advantage of the features that we're talking about. There's even younger households, dad goes out and tries to be a weekend warrior, kind of doing March Madness on the basketball court and comes back with a leg brace on. And all individuals in various household circumstances can take advantage of the features we're talking about. So in the 1900s, we're responding to this great growth in the numbers of people with disabilities. In this century, this demographic is really what's taken hold additionally. So you have this even larger number of people who are aging, and this chart is pretty graphic in terms of the growth in the population. We won't see this even level off until the middle of the century and beyond, at which point, unless we mess things up very badly, that's going to stay constant. We're going to have this large number of older folks with us. And we know that for lots of different reasons, as an older adult, you acquire various disabling conditions with lots of factors involved. But this is a huge demographic which we're now responding to. So these folks are the beneficiaries of this built environment accessibility that we're talking about here, which people are experiencing. Most of us experience these things without thinking about it. I didn't realize as I was walking in this morning that there was no steps coming into this first floor space. That wouldn't have been true 40, 50 years ago and more. It is now. We don't even think about some of the features that are back there. So it's good to know. I think it should hearten you as you struggle maybe with applying the concepts that we're talking about here, that there's a huge beneficiary group with this, whether we realize it or not. So whether it's, as I say, older adults, whether they're living alone, living in groups, living in multi-generational households, it's a huge driving force behind more accommodating design in this century, again, adding to the population from before. So our vision for our time today is to improve the usability of multifamily housing, expand multifamily housing opportunities for a whole variety of folks, right? Ensuring compliance with the Fair Housing Act requirements. Again, we'll help you with a start on this. We won't get through it because there's a lot more detail. And then help you understand the provisions of the Fair Housing Act, the beneficiary groups that we just talked about, and then reference documents. So we'll cover all those things with some brevity. So this is a date for which I would imagine very few of us will have reason to remember, except in a blue book exam at some point. If you're forced to go back and do some forensic research on an old project that's being litigated for time. So I'm not going to dwell on the start dates and the permitting and the occupancy and so on. The important thing from this slide is really to understand that the Fair Housing Act requirements apply only to new construction, not to any kind of renovation. But they do apply to additions, newly constructed additions onto existing projects. So keep that in mind. So it's whether it's a change in use renovation, whether it's a older residential project that's being renovated, Fair Housing Act requirements don't apply to those things, only to new construction. That's one of the limitations of it. So I hope for your benefit, I'm clicking and we're getting a little bit slow on the uptake here, so hopefully we don't go too far ahead. And we'll keep clicking. And we won't be looking at Angelica now, not yet, because we don't want to make her nervous. And maybe you can advance the slide. Well, good try. Go back and do this. Anyway, so here's a nice project with a waterfall. Let me see if I can do this now. There we go. So what do they cover? Condominiums, apartment units, townhomes. That's 95, 96% of our businesses in those three categories. Far less in things like shelters, timeshare units, and single room occupancy. That's just the work that we do. Your work may encompass other things. It's just that's the predominance of it. And you'll notice that two of the top three aren't in fact building or construction styles at all. They're ownership structures, right? So whether it's owned or rented, the Fair Housing Act covers them as long as they've got at least 4 units under one roof. At least 4 units under one roof. You can have a 200-unit project that's got 2 or 3 units under each roof spread out. Fair Housing Act requirements don't apply to those units or that project. It's got to have 4 units or more under one roof. Again, owned or rented, doesn't matter. Welcome. And the guidelines, as you'll see, we have, we certainly have an example of the Fair Housing Amendments Act guidelines over here. I think Ashley brought some others that you may see, so you can reference some of these as we're talking. They're divided into 7 requirements, kind of oddly divided in my opinion. You may also agree, but here are the 7. So there's Public routes of travel and building entrances makes sense. Public and common use areas, we'll talk about that in more detail, also makes sense. One hole requirement just on doors. If you know the accessibility standards, you know that doors is a very complicated area. Lots of dimensional requirements, so maybe it makes sense for that. We have accessible routes inside the unit as a whole requirement of itself. A little bit more attention than I thought that maybe deserved. Requirement 5 is just light switches and other controls. Also kind of a complicated thing in some of the details, which you'll see. Requirement 6, reinforcing for grab bars. Just one whole requirement on that one thing alone. And then 7, potentially the biggest thing of all, kitchens and bathrooms, a whole requirement. Anyway, so it's, you can argue about why they divide it up this way, but anyway, those are the 7. We'll go through all 7. The first 4 on the first half, and the last 3 on the back half of this presentation. So there's the Fair Housing Act design manual. Again, copies around here. If you don't have it, get it. It's available, I'm pretty sure, in print version somehow, certainly as a digital download, which is in some ways useful in other ways, the way digital downloads are, because you can search through the document and get answers to questions. I really recommend that for folks. So that's like the first reference document. It is, in fact, the best single reference document I've ever seen on the topic of accessibility to the built environment. If you know of a better one, I'd love to hear about it. The narrative, the quality of the illustrations, unmatched. Sad that it only applies to multifamily housing, but certainly you can have some lessons. The other sad part about this is that it was last updated in 1998. Colleagues of mine wrote that and published it back then. There were 2 editions. 1998 was the second edition. It has been needed to be updated for many decades. It hasn't yet. We wish at some point that it would soon happen for your benefit and our benefit. Meanwhile, recognizing that it hasn't been updated, HUD, who's the administering entity for this, has decided, well, we're going to point you in some other directions to give you some backstopping for this now aging document. So you've got 15 of them. Most of them you can ignore for most intents and purposes for current work that you're doing, because unless you're doing litigation for older projects, you never have occasion to look at this. But I have number 2 highlighted there because that's the original technical reference document in the manual, as you will see. It's the 1986, what we call then ANSI A117.1. It's now, we now change our reference to that. It's now, because that was American National Standards Institute, it's now the International Code Council, ICC, A117.1. Doesn't really matter much, but that was the original reference document back there. Again, you'd have no particular reason to be looking it up in the current work that you're doing, because the codes have advanced and A117.1 has advanced since then, and those new standards are the standards that apply. So the scoping in the Fair Housing Design Act manual, the explanations that you'll see, the illustrations, terrific stuff to refer to. Technical requirements have moved on in many cases from then. We'll talk about some of those. Then item 5 is the manual itself. But we go on to various other iterations, also very dated. Again, you probably have no reason to look at any of these in current work that you do. And then finally, you've got the 2009 ICC and on for the International Building Code of various editions that have all incorporated the updates to the technical requirements listed in ICC A117.1. Other reference documents, you know, the Americans with Disabilities Act standards of 2010, not bad. They're themselves dated, they update far less often than the A117.1 does, but as a reference document and something that may guide what you do in the publicly available portions of multifamily projects, that'll be your reference point for that. Then you have the pretty much the current law of the land in terms of building codes, the 2017 edition, which is hard to believe. It's 9 years ago that we haven't updated it for anyway. And then the various other editions of the International Building Code. And then finally, the HUD DOJ joint letters, of which there are 2. And did you bring one of them here or both of them?
I brought one of them.
Yeah, one. One deals
Multifamily.
amazingly just with mailboxes. A whole, just on mailboxes, and the other one is even longer and deals with a whole variety of things, questions that are so when you're applying this to your work, you probably should grab hold of those and then hire someone full-time for a week to go through them and figure out what they're actually saying. So these are reference documents that you should be aware of. So we're not going to leave you high and dry. We hope we come back maybe next year with a day-long version of this, which will really take a deep dive into all these different provisions. Short of that, you've got this group, which is amazingly still funded, Fair Housing First. And you can get to their website. I think I checked that out, so it's still happening. They do online trainings all the time that go into these various sections in more detail. And they can even answer, they'll pick up the phone. They'll answer your technical questions, which is really helpful. So know about them. And then know about legal aid. They have a resource section that's still live on their website that has a lot of resources in addition. So those are two great things to know about and to reference if you have questions about how to apply some of these provisions. So here's requirement 1, accessible building entrance on an accessible route. Pretty important. The first thing to know is that if you're designing a building that has elevators, all the units within the building have to comply with it. Fair housing. There's some variations of that, but in general, everything has to comply. Some buildings have elevators, some don't. A lot of them don't. 2- and 3-story projects. So in the cases of multi-story projects that don't have elevators, only the ground floor. And even that topic can be subject to a lot of interpretation. So there's what's a ground floor unit? If you're building on sites out here with terrain change and so on, you can have multiple ground floors. It's true, you can. But it's just the ground floor of those that acts requirements for unit design apply to, and for the accessible routes of travel to apply to. In addition, there's another kind of thick section at the beginning of the design manual that deals with this issue, which acknowledges, and again, out in the western part of the state, this may occur more often than not, that acknowledges the reality of steep terrains and how much are we going to force folks to bulldoze the environment to make accessibility provisions throughout facilities. So there's very detailed site and practicality tests that we don't have time to go into, but they try to account for steep terrain and unusual site characteristics. And there's an elevator building. There's no exemption for that. You got an elevator building, doesn't matter what the site is like, you don't have any exemption for that. And there's 2 other tests, an individual building test and a site analysis test. Deep conversations about those, we can cover that another time, but know that that's out there. So you've got an elevator building, you pretty much have to include fair housing units in those buildings. If it is an elevator building, it's ground floor units, and then buildings subject to the site and practicality tests. And if you're looking through the manual now, there's some extra ones here. You can check that out. So the idea is that you have site accessibility, so that from parking to all of the amenities on the site, you can get there somehow or other, preferably via pedestrian routes of travel, safe pedestrian routes of travel. But in this case, and there is a way to hit a little button. Is that the button? That's the button. In this case, you see, well, it's not, let's see. That's not right. Anyway, you can see down here, there's a tennis court, it looks like, and because it's below in a steep grade, they couldn't manage a pedestrian route of travel, so it's okay to have vehicular routes of travel to places like that. Otherwise, they like to have the routes of travel that are accessible in ways that we'll talk about in a second. So you have to be able to get to the clubhouse entrance, for example, or the gym or whatever else there is there. From the accessible parking spaces, which are also required. No surprises there, you know what the current standards are for that. And the typical slope requirements are in place both then and now. So you may be familiar that parking, very strict regulations around 2% slope in any direction, period. 2% slope at entrances, period, in any direction. 2% cross slope on any of these pathways we're talking about. That's it. It's really just enough to shed water Other than that, that's it. The running slope for these pathways that aren't ramps is 5%, 120. Okay. So for ramps, you know, in my experience, sadly, most of the ramps we see are designed to the maximum slope, minimum requirements possible. Everybody designed ramps to 1 and 12. Bad idea. They also design pathways to 5% slope. Bad idea. Because inevitably you have problems in construction that will put those particular slopes at risk and put either whoever's responsible at risk of having to redo it if there's a problem and somebody complains about the slope. So I never allow projects that we're looking at a 1 and 12 slope ramp to pass before me. 1 and 14 is probably as steep as you want to get. So you're allowing yourself some wiggle room, and probably 4% is as steep as you want to get for running slopes of pathways. Again, lots of detail in there. Curb cuts are challenging to get right on sites that are also challenging. There's a lot of information in the design manual, far more since then, showing our improvement with how this stuff is done, can be done correctly over time, including this, which is our favorite, is really at-grade access to ramps, single slope ramps onto sidewalks from pedestrian street crossings or from parking areas. So you don't have to worry about these compound slopes of things which are problematic. So some of what I'm talking to you about, of course, is editorial from our end. I'm not quoting the design manual. This is what we think should be done. So this is a pretty steep ramp, you'll agree. I began my career in Baston, up north, lived there for 20 years. And in Baston, what we'd call this is a wicked steep ramp. That's probably, I don't know, 1 in 10, 1 in 8, I don't know what it is, but it's what happens sometimes if someone doesn't know what they're doing, or maybe it's even something, it's like even 1 in 11, or, you know, you just don't want to get near that at all. So that's why you design ramps on paper at a less steep slope. But that's wicked steep. This is a much more gentle slope ramp, and it shows you one very beneficial way you might arrange this is you have stairs next to a ramp, perfectly fine. Lots of folks will take the stairs, other folks will take the ramp. No big deal. Gives people choices and options about this. So that's the 8.33B is the 1 in 12 ramp. Don't go near that, please. 5% is the running slope of walkways. Don't go near that. 2% you can't do much with. You're kind of tied in there because there's not a whole lot of variability. That's the cross slopes on ramps, on walkways, parking at landings, just enough to shed water. So that's requirement 1. Requirement 2 is what are all the places we need to get to? I showed you a little bit earlier what that looks like, and there are a lot of them. So there's places like mailboxes, dumpsters, swimming pools, clubhouses, exercise rooms, laundry, dog parks, picnic areas, car washes. And the trick with this is that the design manual isn't completely comprehensive about listing all these things, even though they need to be accommodated. And it's great on your access up to them and into them, not always applying a high accessibility standard to the usability of those themselves. Mailboxes is an exception, we'll talk about that. Dumpsters is an exception. You have to have access to a swimming pool, but not access into a swimming pool. You don't have to have a lift according to fair housing or a ramp, unless you're renting the pool to the outside world. Maybe you have a pool membership. In that case, ADA covers that, and you have to pull that in. So all those different places. You have to have the dumpsters that are usable. Clubhouses, yes. Exercise rooms, yes. You don't have to have any particular kind of accessible exercise equipment in the exercise room, just space to get around. Laundry we'll talk about. Again, all these are the things. Outside storing at playing fields, amphitheaters, sun decks, playgrounds, all these things. Access to them, not necessarily a high level of access once you get to them. They want to do this for other reasons, but the Fair Housing Act isn't requiring that you do that. And importantly, things like the leasing office. This is where on most projects, you'll have the ADA applying to a very few areas, the Fair Housing Act applying to most of the other areas. The leasing office is one of them because the public can get into that, has to get into that. So the ADA would take sway. It's not that there's a huge difference, but ADA's been updated more recently. So there you see in that little obelisk there with a little tiny roof is a very inappropriately located series of mailboxes, way high in the air. Shorter folks who live there and people who operate from a seated position, I'm sure can't reach that higher level mailbox lot. So that's not allowed. They're very particular about this, and this is an area of amazing controversy and problem. Witness an entire letter from HUD and DOJ addressing just mailboxes, because the post office has their idea about what's appropriate, and the acts and accessibility standards have their idea about what's appropriate. But this is closer to what you should be seeing and producing in mailboxes and projects that you talk about. Much more linear space taken up, further shorter, as high as 48 or 54 inches potentially, and also further up. You could go as low as 15, but the post office doesn't really like that. So 28 is probably what you can do. I'm gonna go find my water, which I've lost. Grab this. So that's closer to what you're saying. We're actually dealing with one of these right now. Replacing a series of mailboxes that were inappropriately designed, spec'd, and located back in the day. They're being replaced now. What do we do? How do we get the kind of access to the mailbox and at the heights that we need without costing a huge amount of money? I apologize for my somewhat scratchy throat. If I'm clearing my throat, I've got the tail end, the non-contagious tail end of a respiratory thing. So be assured for that. Okay, so yeah, access to tennis courts, either by car or via a path of travel. Access to pools, again, you don't have to have an accessible pool, you have to have an accessible route to the pool. And this can get tricky when you think about the safety gates that are often at pool areas, which you need to have to keep kids from going in there. How do you make those safety gates accessible to folks to get in, but not accessible to kids? Tricky thing. Water fountains, of course. Oh, well, just said, this is the guy after whom my institute was named, R.L. Mace. That's the guy. He's the architect, North Carolina-based architect, who developed this manual with his colleagues, and who was really a pioneer in the field. And then in terms of restrooms in the public area, so you have to follow the standard restroom stuff. You wouldn't want to be paying attention to what's in the design manual there. Again, the scoping is in there. The technical requirements are a little bit dated. So you don't want to use the modern requirements that you'll find in the ADA or in the state building code for this. So there are exceptions to this. Fair housing, again, doesn't require tons of access in some places, but other code requirements will come in. So this is an example of upgrades since yonder time. So the old standard was always, for years and years, a 60-inch turning diameter to accommodate somebody who's very able in their wheelchair to spin around. Not many people can actually do that. And they've changed that in the 2017 ICC, which I referenced earlier. It's now a 67-inch turning circle. These things don't apply inside your residential units, by the way. They have very particular, and not, and just as a side note, and not into renovations of existing buildings, if you're doing ADA type stuff, right? This is the old standard, and this doesn't even apply inside the residential units that fair housing talks about, because as you see, there's a couple places where you have this, but it's not part of that. So the left-hand image is the old standard, the right-hand image is the new standard. And I'd recommend to people, you've got those two images. One is the turning diameter, the circle, and the other is the T-turn. I'd recommend people look more at the T-turn more often than people typically do, to allow you for some more flexibility in your design inside tighter spaces. Because you can tuck things in with a T-turn, whereas this turning diameter, it's really very limiting. So also they've changed the standards on clear floor space. So the old standby for many decades, well, you have to assume a 30-inch wide by 48-inch long amount of space, a rectangle that someone in a wheelchair needs to have to get up to lots of things, mailboxes, appliances, water fountains, and so on. The 2017 ICC changed that, interestingly, just to 52. They didn't widen it, they just lengthened it by 4 inches. So again, new projects, not the interiors of the units we're talking about, but in new projects, you'll find that this is incorporated in 2017. It's incorporated in the building code in North Carolina, because if I'm not mistaken, 2018 IBC that we've adopted here captures the 2017 ICC, if that's not too much alphabet soup. And the reason why is that people realized over the years, the anthropometry, as we say, is that people are bigger, and there's a huge proliferation in the number and type of wheeled devices that people use. So they had to do something to accommodate that, because people were getting into space saying, I can't use this. This is the device I use all the time, so they had to enlarge it. Again, it applies in certain circumstances. So you won't like me saying this. This is our friend Scott, who I think, again, you may have occasion to call HUD for explanations. You may not. This is the guy who may be at the other end of the phone at HUD. If you call this summer, from maybe this summer on. This guy used to work with us. This is why we had him pose for some of these pictures for us. He now works for HUD, and he will take over that. So if you can't get answers from the Fair Housing First people, you can call our buddy Scott Winley up at HUD at some point, and maybe he'll be answering the phone. Very knowledgeable. He worked at the Access Board for many years. That Access Board for us, as I say, a long time ago. But just as an example, you have to have an accessible route into a laundry area. Do you have to have front control, front opening wash and dryer? No. You can have standard inaccessible washers and dryers. Just doesn't go that far in many cases. Likewise with, it doesn't handle everything equally well. It talks about the eating areas that might be present inside clubhouses and so on. It doesn't really address those in a way that I'm happy with. You may have to struggle to figure out exactly how far do you go and so on. In general, you want to err on the side of more accessibility if possible, even if the requirements aren't that specific. Don't give yourself a break and the future management folks a break by going further than maybe they might need to. Dumpsters, right? Citing the dumpster, the #1 problem in all multifamily project development. We agree? I'm kidding. It's often a problem, right? Where you look, and nobody wants them near them. You don't want them out at the street where other people can dump their stuff in there. You don't want to have those big trucks coming in. It's a real problem. And the accessibility is also an issue in many cases. Those squeaky, doors that go open and close, very difficult for a lot of people to use. My mom could have never used those things. And this is a great solution. We're offering it up for your consideration. I'm not sure how possible it is, but syncing them, which eliminates a large part of the visual clutter that you might have from that. It also makes it obviously more accessible because it lowers down a simple lifting and throwing of the trash in rather than that funky little door that sometimes happens. So locating them is a real problem. I can attest to that. So those are the first 2 requirements. Routes of travel, what kinds of buildings, what are the elements on site, the amenities that need to be made accessible on these routes. And then requirement 3 is usable doors. And if you have, there's our friend Scott again, if you have dealt with the ADA requirements and the IBC and the building code, you know that there's a whole big, fat, detailed section in those documents dealing with the dimensional requirements around doors. It's bewildering and complicated. How wide the space is you're coming from, how wide the space is you're going to, how wide the doorway is, which side the hinge is on. Very complicated. The design manual deals with that somewhat, but you're really going to have to refer to the more modern documents for the full coverage and the real requirements in this day and age about how you need to accommodate that. But this is just one example. In some circumstances, at 18 inches flat side clearance on the side that you're pulling. On the lat side, as we say. Yes, yeah.
Back to that slide for just a second. Isn't there a requirement, since that door has a closer, is it not 24 inches?
It may be now. I refer you to those complicated documents that I mentioned before. it's a real challenge, but yeah, maybe 24 inches in some circumstances, yeah. Good question. So that was the question, is it 18 or 24? It could very well be 24 in some circumstances with doors that have closers. Nice catch. And you want to avoid things like this. This is kind of the classic circumstance. You think about someone using a wheelchair, someone using a walker, same kind of thing. Someone using crutches, same kind of thing. You want to give people maneuvering room as they're using doors going to and fro. I'll just remind you that in the interior of the units, none of this stuff applies. This is all the public doorways that people use going around the property or within the main public areas of buildings. Inside the units, you don't have any of this applying, only the primary entrance door. So it's a very light touch. I mean, there's our 18 inches. A very light touch in unit interiors. And I've said before, and I'll say this now, that one of the main advantages of the Fair Housing Act is the public accessibility, the parking spaces, the leasing office, did I hit that? All the amenity areas, all those routes of travel. Inside the unit, as you'll see, not so much in there. I mean, in terms of being really usable by somebody who uses a wheelchair, not so good. It's why we're getting more involved in the multifamily area now, in coming up with alternative standards that actually would let people, again, with this century's demographic, age in place better and not have to leave sooner. So all kinds of requirements in terms of hardware, loop hardware, depending upon the situation and circumstance, and force restrictions on how heavy a door can be with closers and otherwise to get through. So that's the first three. Here's the fourth requirement. So this is into the unit itself, and within the unit itself. So the whole dimensional requirements around doorways, very complicated, lots of if, then kind of things. Interestingly, also with threshold type, lots of different variations and options to make that threshold as minimally a barrier as you can. And these are just two examples. I think these were also referenced directly in the design manual. But that's the idea, is to just limit the areas of trip hazards, limit the areas where a walker might be caught, limit the areas where a wheelchair might not be able to get over easily. And there's a big area within a lot of apartments that we've seen. And that's really if you have a balcony, the access out to the balcony for generations, the standard solution to those was sliding doors with those big tracks. Not actually allowed under fair housing. We've had many occasions where we've had to go in and cite, dozens of these, where someone couldn't actually get out to the balcony because of those tracks. And the solutions are uniformly not good. So I would avoid those. And I think that the solutions these days, more often than not, are hinged doors of some kind. They can accommodate a much flatter threshold like that than these big high things. And so that, I think, has become, I have not taken a survey of all the hundreds and thousands of units that have gone in around here over the past 10 years, but my sense is that more and more of them are doing the hinged door, flatter threshold option. Do people have any experience with that? Can you attest? Is that true, that most of these balcony access routes are hinged doors rather than sliding doors, or not? No?
We're in hinged doors for most of ours.
Yeah.
Especially deconstruction.
Yeah, okay. So this shows one crappy solution to a primary, I think this is a primary entrance door, where it was built a couple inches up. It's not allowed. You can't have a couple inch step. And oftentimes you get into these situations where do you raise the whole landing area? Do you raise the whole walkway? And sometimes in accommodations, you have to make do with things you wouldn't prefer otherwise. So this is what you're kind of faced with. You don't want to have to do this for a lot of reasons. Better do it right the first time. So interestingly, in fair housing units, you can have something that we almost never see. I'm not sure I've seen this very much in a long time, which is a sunken living room. You can actually have a sunken living room in a fair housing unit. Should this ever come up, I'm sure it never will. But at one point in time, they were a thing. long as you have a route of travel around that sunken living room to all the other areas of the house. Not very complicated. You have to be able to get to all the occupied spaces without a problem, without any barriers and so on. And there's dimensional requirements as to how wide a hallway needs to be, how wide an archway needs to be. Door width is again a pretty picky thing. Let me see if I can. All right, let's go back here. So the 32-inch wide clear opening on doors is an issue, right? The standards in ADA for a lot of doorways is 36 inches wide. Got a 36-inch wide doorway. That results in kind of a clear opening effectively of about 34 inches, which is generally regarded as kind of the gold standard for passageways for people with equipment and getting through here. There are a lot of compromises made when the Fair Housing Act requirements were being developed, because it was in fact a private sector, public sector advocacy collaboration that came up with this, which is why we have so many of the kind of partial solutions. And so a nominal, it's not even a 32-inch wide clear opening, it's a nominal 32-inch wide clear opening. And somewhere here, I've got those numbers. So 31 and 5/8, I think, is what appears in the design manual. In North Carolina, interestingly, 31 and 3/4. So as I say, the stricter standard will always apply. In this case, that's what you're limited to. So the notion that you could spec a 32-inch door and get a 32 and 3/4 clear opening out of it, I'm not sure whether you'd be able to get that clearance, right? And the clear opening is as it says here, it's from the edge of the door to the edge of the stop. We were holding fast for years in our consulting work and in the standards that we were developing for my institute that 34-inch doors should really be more of a standard in residential settings. We didn't like 36. I don't like 36-inch wide doors in most residences, unless there's somebody in there right now who needs it, because it's more institutional looking and feeling. We're trying to talk about universal design before. We're trying to get things to feel more like high function yet broadly appealing. We've kind of fallen back to here now after being beat down for decades. Probably this is okay. It's way better than a lot of the doors. I was in a friend's house last night, and the bathroom door, into their guest bathroom, 22 inches wide. And you know that if you know this, you know that it's common. There's things back there. So 32 is way better than that. But anyway, know about that. In terms of interiors and door width, if you can get into a space, it's an occupied space, you have to adhere to those door widths. If it's not an occupied space, like a closet like this, you can have a narrower door than that. That's okay. So if you have a walk-in or roll-in closet, that door would have to be the same nominal 32 inches wide. So hard is site impracticality. I don't wish that on anyone. Maybe that's why we don't encounter it that often, because it's a complicated series of calculations. Curb cuts, as I mentioned, fairly difficult thing. Thresholds, this amazingly complicated thing is how do you bridge gaps, especially if there's been a mistake somewhere along the line. How do you make that right to get your CO correctly? And then the whole townhouse issue, which we didn't dwell on long. Again, in general, townhouse design, narrow footprint, multi-stories, exempted from coverage under fair housing. Some townhouses can be one story, so some of those are included. So you have to sort that out. And the design manual does a good job of figuring that out for you. Are there questions? There probably are questions as we pause here. Okay, we can take questions along the way because we got a little bit of time. So these are the first 4 requirements. We've done those. We've given you some background and this broad beneficiary group. That's the real group of folks who can benefit from these things, which is all good. And we'll cover the other 3s after. So this is us. Our office is actually downtown here on 50 South French Broad. And that's me, and we do a lot of service. We're actually a nationwide nonprofit. We work all over the country, including here in Asheville and Buncombe County. We're happy to do that, and all over North Carolina. My background is as a planner. but I've worked with the design profession, construction professions for many, many decades in every kind of environment you can imagine. So that's us. Okay, so we can actually take a short break. Angelique, if people, and you can pull up the other show if you want to, and then we only have another half an hour, so, and you're gonna come in at the end, right?
Yeah, we'll just.
Few things, okay. So we'll just pull up the other show and go with there. So 5 through 7, again, you know, has 7 is the big dog. 7 is all bathrooms and all kitchens. 2 most complicated rooms in the house. And we'll have a lot to say about that stuff. Okay. There we go. So there we go. Light switches and other controls, interestingly complicated. Reinforcing for grab bars. We'll have comments on that as well, and then kitchens and bathrooms. So on the one hand, this is fairly limited because it's just these things on the wall you have to operate. And in general, in the field, it's all about lowering them and raising them, not having things too high, not having things too low, with lots of exceptions. So what's covered under the Act is light switches, outlets, and heating and ventilating. That's it. What's not covered specifically is anything to do with appliances, special outlets like behind the refrigerator, and breaker boxes, just not included in this. So again, when you get inside units, not a really heavy hand compared to some other accessibility standards. Here's our poor little guy with a walker who shows you what happens, what bad things happen if you put outlets too low. And a more realistic thing, this shows you the lower minimum these days. I don't even remember any longer what the Fair Housing Manual states, but this is the current standards for how low you need to mount it. It's really to the lowest outlet prong. It's not the middle of the outlet. It's the lowest of the two. So mounting heights for outlets, 15 minimum, 48 maximum, again to the highest, it's really to the highest operable portion of anything, whether it's a switch or whether it's a dial or something. It's not to the middle of them. There's our friend using that. When you get into kitchens is where you get into real complications. Again, because people were trying to grapple with the limitations that folks can have if they're using wheelchairs and maybe additional impairments besides that. So you see in the manual, lots of attention and detail, all good stuff about how high and how low, depending upon whether you're reaching over something from the side, over something from the front. Lots of that stuff is in there. We won't go into detail now. And you could decide to just do a happy medium, just keep things as low as you can over counters, not have to worry about some of those other factors. But you can see here's one of the great illustrations that are in there, having to do with side reach over a counter, the 46-inch max for that. You know, so the kitchens, well, we'll go into that later, sorry. But anyway, so you get into complications in those spaces, a little bit less so in bathroom because it's just not as much outlet-y stuff in there. There's usually one outlet and one switch, not quite as much of a problem. So that's requirement 5. Requirement 6 is the reinforcement for grab bars. Holy cow. So this is, I'm not sure how much this is advanced in the years since. I haven't done a comparison between what's in here and what's maybe in some of the other standards. But our problem with this all along, because the Act doesn't require grab bars, right? There's no grab bars required, which in general we like, because we like grab bars in places people need them, not grab bars in places that the code says they should be, because we have no idea whether anybody could use them in those locations, especially behind the toilet. I mean, I don't know, not many people use those kinds of things, but they're taking, many cases, you know, public restroom standards and importing them into someone's residential situation. 2 things. One is, let's go through here. And so there's stuff behind. If you have a corner mounted a toilet, you've got blocking there. You've got blocking in tubs. You have blocking in showers. Is that the end of our blocking? Right, of all kinds. And our point, again, is that it's hard to imagine that people will just need grab bars in those locations. So we always recommend broadly applied sheet blocking underneath the finished wall, so you can mount a grab bar wherever people need them, not in this narrow band. On the one hand, on the other hand, this is where you can come in and use your experience. Since this was developed and since I started, the whole proliferation of safe grab bar mounting in locations that don't have blocking has exploded, right? Every manufacturer has these hollow wall anchors for their grab bars that they insist works well and works fine and works compliant to the 250-pound shear test, right, which is required. Has anyone here had any experience with that? And do we need to even worry about blocking anymore? I don't know. I mean, it's a question I wish I could answer. But anyway, I did a test in my bathroom with one of these things, hollow wall anchors, to see. I'm unconvinced. I did a DIY thing and it doesn't see. Anyway, so these are the requirements for blocking, and it might look like this. This is a little bit wider than some of it, you might want to space that within, but between the studs. So here we are, requirement 7. Usable kitchens and bathrooms. So to extend my thought earlier about the light touch for accessibility that's present in the requirements, you've got some potentially additional space at appliances between cabinet faces that are required there. And in terms of maneuvering room in U-shaped kitchens particularly. But the wall cabinets don't have to be lowered. The countertops can still be at 36 inches. Knee space is not required. And as we know in kitchens, other spaces, it's pretty expensive to make those changes. Now, in a multifamily situation, you're not likely to be making those changes anyway. But one of the disconnects you'll find in the manual, maybe in all of fair housing, is that they reference visually and otherwise and continuously people who use wheelchairs all the time. That's back then, that was the primary audience. And the disconnect is that it's not that accessible for people who use wheelchairs. So you can see they require some space in front of an appliance, in front of a stove, in front of a sink, all good stuff. They don't require turning diameter, except in one occasion. And they don't require you to be able to pull under either of those things either. It's what the compromise had to make. So here you see, they don't require front controls on the stove, what you see here. We think that's a good idea for lots of people. We expect that usually, and for older adults as well, but not required. They do have, it's a very complicated series of images and discussion and narrative in the manual about all the different locations and what the space requirements might be. It's not required to have a 30 by 40 inch clear floor space for front approach at a refrigerator. I'm not sure it's necessary either, but they have it covered in case you have that circumstance. It's not a bad thing. So there's your 40-inch clearance. That's the clearance that they're looking for between cabinet faces. It doesn't include handles, or it doesn't include the countertop projection. It's between cabinet faces. And it may be better than you might find otherwise. We like people that do 42, and like with ramps and so on, I would never expect ever a 40-inch clearance between cabinet faces in any project, because we've walked around projects, with 15 lawyers trailing behind us as we measure a 39-inch clearance and a 38-inch clearance at these things, and it's just not worth it. Don't go below 42, because it just, what if a different cabinet style or something comes up, or they made some change on site? You don't want to risk it. So you do that. So, and again, they go into very much detail on the wide variety of circumstances you might find in kitchens. And so have a U-shaped kitchen and nothing else is true, you do have to have this 60-inch diameter in there. And again, the 67-inch doesn't apply in these kinds of things now. And this shows someone with the side approach to the sink, awkwardly, because it looks like their left hand is there, more usable hands, so they're reaching over. Access to the stove, access to the refrigerator. So it shows you how that space might be used. And in cases where you have a U-shaped kitchen that doesn't have that, that's the one occasion, there's two, but there's one occasion where knee space under the sink has to be something that's provided. So someone can actually pull up and use that. Again, all detailed in the manual. We're making progress here. So this might be what that knee space might look like. This was actually from a kitchen that my colleagues did in Raleigh years ago that tried to say, we're experimenting, but how do you make a universally designed kitchen? Something that kind of straddles the needs of folks who use wheelchairs with the needs of folks who are standing. And this is one option. And it's what you might find in a fair housing project with knee space that's provided, because the countertop is still high. And that's for us the limiting factor is why we've abandoned that for general purpose recommendations and other kinds of housing. Because after all, if you're the full-time resident there and you use a wheelchair full-time and you're the person who's doing the cooking, why do you want a counter that comes up to here? You don't. You want a lower counter. So this is one of the compromises that they made in the act and the guidelines. That's what was possible. So, as I enumerated earlier, appliance and control design not included here. Lowered counter height is not part of the kitchen area. Lowered storage, not there. Microwave location, right? The worst microwave location of all is the place that's usually in most homes. Where's your microwave?
Above the stove.
Above your stove, right? In my house, above the stove is bad because, especially for older people, the older you get, the shorter you get. And you don't want to have us reaching up and pulling a hot thing out of the microwave and then spilling it on top of ourselves. Much less if you are operating from a seated position, you can't do it at all. So we always recommend other locations for microwaves. Refrigerator styles are specified. We know some are easier to use than others, and there's no open knee space required in kitchens. So it's got a little bit of maneuvering room, a little bit better than you might find if these regulations weren't in place. But honestly, and this is particularly for older adults. You see, we talk about in that context with this demographic of aging in place, that's the big thing. So how do you let someone age in place? Or if they go from being able to be ambulatory to using one piece of equipment to using another piece of equipment, as soon as you get into the walker phase of things get to be very difficult inside these units. So people are not able to age as well as they might be otherwise. Again, that's why we're getting more involved in this these days than we have before. All right, bathrooms. No questions? Questions on kitchens? Since we're gonna have time, I'm gonna force people to introduce themselves afterwards, so get ready for that. Okay, bathrooms, another area. I mean, in general, when we talk about more accessible, more accommodating parts of a house, the bathroom is the one space guaranteed you're going to have to enlarge it compared to what you may be used to building, what you may be used to seeing. But having said that, it does have to be on this accessible route, just like kitchens. Got to have the same clear door open. Got to have the switches that are appropriately located. You have to have the ground reinforcement, which we've already talked about. And it says sufficient. You know, I'm allowed to editorialize here in ways that AD and others can't. It should be in quotes. Or it should be insufficient because it really isn't. As the lack of accommodations in kitchens, it really doubles down in bathrooms because there's really very little there. So you've got these two bathroom styles that the manual talks about. We have a strong preference for one of the two. See if you can guess which one. And it talks about in great detail all the clearances you need to have within the bathroom to meet the requirements of the Act. So this is, I would characterize as our classic 5x8 bathroom. Many of us grew up with these, many of us may have these in our homes. We have one of them, and it is, as you can see here, completely unusable by someone who you could probably brush your teeth if you could back up far enough to use the sink. If you had the door swinging out, it might be easier, right? You don't have that door swing. If there's one piece of advice in these tiny bathrooms, if you're doing type A bathrooms, is have the door swing out somehow or other, so you get some room to, as you'll see, there it is, nothing unusual, maybe a little longer. I mean, some bathrooms that wouldn't have these might be 5 by 7 or even shorter. We've seen pretty small bathrooms, but this is kind of a 5 by 8-ish. So this shows you, I think this is from the manual, you know, how somebody might miraculously pull up to the tub, put their feet inside the tub, then lean over sideways to adjust the water temperature. Not many folks are able to do that if they're already using a wheelchair. So it's very, very dicey for that. And we put this in here because older adults, they may not use a piece of equipment, but their balance is such, my balance is such, that do I want to have to squeeze between the toilet and the tub and then lean over and get that? We don't want to do that. So it doesn't work for a lot of people. And okay, here we go. So it has lots of requirements. So indeed, if you have a wall-hung sink, you know, next to a tub, it lets you pull up, and that's actually an easier reach, right, for some folks to get in there. So they have those lots and lots of options. So if you want to, you know, parse it and do as little as you possibly can, you can actually do a better job in some circumstances than others. It doesn't require, in the Act also, a zero threshold shower. Even the Type A units, not the bathrooms, they don't always have that as well. So this just shows a picture of you know, what these bathrooms may look like and a standard location of toilets in little tiny alcoves. This is actually a place that we lived, now that I remember. And there's the dimensional requirements around doorways, somewhat tortured, the dimensional requirements and locational requirements in bathrooms with toilet locations, also somewhat tortured. I invite you to look through and study what the manual has to say about this. One of the interesting things these days is that there's been more research on the aging population than there was back in the 1900s. Back then, lots of research, anthropometric research and so on people who use wheelchairs. Lots of that stuff happened, in part to inform all the codes and standards we have now. These days, they're looking at older adults, and it turns out some of those needs differ. And so they're looking even at things like toilet placement, space needed around toilets and so on with fresh eyes. Maybe if we meet again, we'll be able to report back on what some of that stuff has, which may not affect what you're able to do here because, as you know, practice and research is always way in advance of what the codes and regulations are. That's the nature of things. But anyway, these are 3 options for how toilets might be located in there. So that was the A bathroom. Here's our preferred option, which is the B bathroom. And in every case, they separate the bathing fixture from the other 2 fixtures in the bathroom, which is better. It provides more accessibility, especially if, again, you have that door swing out. Let's see what we got here. That's better. And if they do one other thing that is not shown in this image, can anybody name that one thing that might make this a more usable bathroom for that poor person using the wheelchair? Has to do with the tub. You move the wet wall down here so that you're not having to deal with this, but you can pull up right next to it and reach sideways more easily. So that one change with the outswinging door make this far more usable. You still can't turn around, right? And there's no requirement for, there's a suggestion in some circumstances to have knee space underneath here, but that's only if you can't do certain other kinds of requirements. But that one thing would make a difference, and that's why when we produce our specs and so on, we always call for that being on the opposite wall, opposite end of the tub and bathing fixture. So yeah, so they don't require the zero threshold shower. They allow showers, curb showers, and we don't mind the 3x3 curb shower. That's actually a pretty good option for a lot of folks. And of course, the building code and so on allows 30-inch wide zero threshold showers, should you get to that point, which are not useful width of shower of zero threshold showers. 36 inches is really the minimum width for showers, if you're going to include them in your project, and we hope that you do. So this is just a variety of other imagery showing different orientations. There's a lot of different orientations of bathrooms, not just your standard rectangle. You have different configurations that can fit into a more complicated floor plan. With the sink being sticking out one way, with the toilet sticking out one way and the bathing fixture over there. So, all different configurations. And there's I'm newly enamored by this 3x3 shower. It's really, I'm not giving it much love in my career up until now, but I'm liking them more and more because they're small, they're compact. You don't have to have, in fact, you wouldn't want to have a zero threshold. You want to have a curve there. And you can step up to it and sit down. You could transfer, those are also called transfer showers. And even for older adults, you're not subject, check me out, Sheila, to really the same kind of tripping because you're not really striding into the shower anyway. You're just kind of stepping in. I'm liking these more. And another illustration. We have tons of stuff on our website as well. We'd be happy to share with you that talk about bathrooms and interiors and kitchens and so on that will take you further down the line here. And on and on and on. There's endless configurations that could work out in relatively small spaces. This is one where, in fact, we're saying, hey, let's put the 5 fraternity diameter in here and see what you get. These are actually, obviously far bigger bathrooms. If you thought about this in terms of the T-turn, maybe you could make it a little bit more compact. In this case, you've got the 3 foot deep, zero threshold shower there. And it could be a tiled shower, it could be a setup shower, it doesn't matter. Yeah, and then these are several, we talked about curbless showers for a long time also. So again, I hope I've conveyed that avoiding minimums of design requirements is a good thing in your projects. So avoid both the legal and functional minimums of ramps, avoid the clear floor space minimums, floor space minimums in bathrooms and kitchens to save yourself trouble. We talked about the nominal door width and how we've reluctantly kind of come to the dark side on this and said, given industry standards, I guess it's okay. And we haven't inspected 36-inch wide door in residence for a long, long time. But backing off of the special order 34-inch wide door to this far more common 32, we're kind of at that place. It's separate from this, right? This is our other work because fair housing covers multifamily, 88 covers kind of everything else. What's not covered is single family duplexes and triplexes. Most of the residences in the country are one of those, right? Which almost nothing tackles. So we do a lot of work in that area because of the big delta between where it's being built now, where it needs to be to accommodate all the populations, especially older adults. Real challenges in being careful about how you render reach ranges for switches and outlets and everything else. And again, there's a reminder here that, in general, people are stunned by the lack of tolerance that's allowed in the accessibility codes compared to what they're used to in the rest of construction, because they make such a difference in usability. An inch can make all the difference in the world for someone being able to get through a doorway or get into a shower or something. And it's not mentioned in here at all. So be very careful about it. That's why we keep encouraging people to build beyond the minimums to avoid trouble later on. So in these kinds of projects, if you're building according to this, and for requirements 1, 2, and 3, it's pretty accessible. I mean, that's really the big lift and the big benefit we see on these projects that are under the jurisdiction of Fair Housing Act. Pretty good. And there is actually improved access within the units, which is requirements 4, 5, 6, and 7, compromised and limited and constrained in the ways I've described. Again, this was not an advocacy document. This was a highly compromised document between the advocacy forces and the industry and government. So that's why you wound up with this. Better than it might have been otherwise, but not as certainly many. The hair pulling was probably significant back in between 88 and 92 when some of this stuff came out. Right, so that's it for this. So those are my advisories, is to be careful about the minimums and so on. Any questions? And I will go around the room now. I'm going to punish you for being one of the good people to show up here by asking you to tell me what you do. Sir, I'll start with you.
My name's Marty Benson. I work at a law firm up the hill, mostly doing business litigation and land use stuff.
Well disguised, sir. Well disguised.
Thanks, man.
So we have a lawyer here, and you can introduce yourself.
Billy Breeden. I work for Buncombe County Aging and Adult Services as the age-friendly coordinator, and I advocate for older adults.
Thank you for being here, sir.
Craig Hogan, I'm a project designer for McMillan Paston Smith.
Tell me the name again.
McMillan Paston Smith,
Okay.
MPS.
You work on multifamily,
Yes.
obviously. Very good. Chris?
Chris Zajac with Mountain Housing. I build multifamily rentals.
So you're right in the middle of this.
Yep.
Lady in the back with the colorful shirt.
Me. I'm Sheila O'Connor, and I'm an occupational therapist. I've worked a lot with Richard collaborating, but I look at accessibility for homes, especially people that have had some type of accident, injury. How they can be as independent as possible.
Well, and she's a great resource. And the gentleman, did he leave? He left.
His
Maybe he'll be
laptop's
back.
still here.
Okay, he may be back. All right. So, yeah, so you have, these are really display copies of the Fair Housing Manual, right? They're not to give away?
Yeah, no, but I placed copies on each
Yeah.
table if you wanna flip through. I'm not a builder, and I think that they're pretty easy to follow along, so.
And you've got the resources we talked about, Fair Housing First, these guys and their resource. We have ours as well. We have tons of information, less on regulatory compliance, which is what this is about, and more on general purpose information about aging in place features, accessible housing, and then universal design, which is a whole separate topic for this. Anyway, so did you want to come and say a few things, or we have any questions? No?
So yeah, again, I'm AD staff, I'm a supervising attorney with the Fair Housing Project of Legal Aid, so we're a statewide project. And we investigate, litigate, represent clients that have experienced housing discrimination, and disability discrimination is probably our largest area. And I just wanted to, again, say that if it's federally funded housing, then, these things apply, even if it is the townhome or, a single family home. And like I said, I am not a builder, but I find that the accessibility standards in that manual are pretty easy to use. The pictures are nice, and, I think it's helpful. And I just wanted to also say that, like, some of the things that we see, accessibility in the bathroom is it's a huge issue, and then accessible routes into and out of housing is also a huge thing. And I love that Richard said, don't get close to the max or the minimum. Just, you don't want a bunch of attorneys walking around and like it's coming down to, an inch or two, or a percentage, or a degree. So, it's when housing is accessible to a person with a disability, then it is usable by everyone. So making housing accessible doesn't mean that it's then unusable by someone that does not have a disability or a need. And so I think it's a good philosophy to sort of like carry. And then also just think about like the actual usability. So like grab bars, for example. What we see a lot of is there are grab bars in the bathroom, but are they actually usable by the person that needs them? I see a lot of grab bars behind a toilet. I don't know how I don't know who is using them or how they were ever used. So just like sort of thinking through that stuff when if you're doing it on the ground floor, like how is it actually going to be used? Somebody try grabbing them and see what you think. And then also with like showers and tubs, I just want to mention that like shower chairs, the flip down ones, they also make sliding ones, which are really great, especially if you've got a smaller shower stall. Those sliding ones are a dream, because it slides out, the person can get on and then slide in, and it makes the transition a lot simpler. And then also more recently, we've been looking into like, when we're talking about like converting bathrooms to be accessible, those tub cuts can also be, I think, pretty, like a good solution, instead of like a full-on like remodel or like replacing the whole thing. Those can, you know, either the door's closed or it's open and, you know, not be as like institutionally looking. And then, you know, also thinking about ramps and those sort of accessible entrances. I know, you know, you guys are out here in the mountains, and so I think that's a really important part is like how reasonable and like realistic are those routes to certain types of housing, just sort of thinking through that. And my email is on one of the handouts. I can never remember to make a business card, but we are always happy to talk through these things. Coming up with solutions for our clients is always going to be faster. And we're, you know, always want to try and figure out like a compromise or what can work for the person that is, you know, needing these accessibility features. And then what's realistic for the housing provider. We're not contrary to the great jokes about attorneys. We want to come up with a reasonable solution for everybody, and not always litigate. As fun as it is, we don't want to do that. It takes a lot of time. Are there any questions like on the legal side of things? Cool. Go forth and accessorize.
Can you address anything in regards to the CDBG DR aspect of the funding now that we're really getting into that funding source? And if there's anything extra that we need to know?
Yeah, just that it's federal it's federal funding, and so these requirements fit again, even if it's not multifamily housing. So if you're a contractor or you're a part of, you know, a program like administering those funds, just knowing that those accessibility features also apply, even if it's like a single family housing or not multifamily, because it's that federal funding. Does that make? So if we're talking about like, the difference would be like if you're doing like privately funded housing, and we're talking about sort of accessibility features like outside of the design and construction, and you're looking at like maybe a modification where the tenant would potentially be paying for like any changes to a unit. Does that make sense-ish? But when it's federally funded, it's different. And then it's the builders or the housing provider's responsibility.
You have paperwork on reasonable accommodations and reasonable modifications over there?
I did not bring those, but I can send those out with,
Well, just maybe mention.
yeah.
Because isn't that a big issue oftentimes for people post-construction also? Is that accessibility and accommodations and what that means?
Yeah, so post-construction, it's already been built, your provider accommodations for someone with a disability is changing like rules or policies. So a really typical example would be an assigned parking space on an accessible route, so that person knows that they have the space to park in order to like utilize that accessible route into their housing. That would be a change in the rules if there's not otherwise assigned parking spaces. That would be an accommodation. A modification is a physical change to the unit. Again, this is post-construction. And then in privately funded housing, then you're looking at the tenant sort of taking on that cost, and the housing provider, landlord, property owner, whoever, approving those changes. And federally funded housing, then the housing provider would be responsible for the cost. And there's some exceptions to that, but generally, like modifications and accommodations are like post-construction, it's already finished, people are moving in, they're living there, that kind of thing. It's a quick and dirty accommodation modification.
So my add-on to that is that, you know, the Act's provisions apply to multifamily housing and these other circumstances regardless if it's owned or rented, and regardless of funding source, but funders can always impose their own requirements. So I was thinking, Chris, in your LIHTC projects, the Housing Finance Agency
Yeah.
makes you do certain things that go beyond,
It's stricter than this in a lot
Yeah.
of cases.
and whether it's HUD, home, CDBG, every funder like that can impose their own additional requirements on projects.
And they measure slopes and ramps, is my understanding.
We have to basically bring on a accessibility consultant that approves it on behalf of NCHFA.
Yeah,
Good.
okay.
Cool. Thank you all for coming.
You're done.